back to a very exciting holiday edition, at least here in the US, of D&D Beyond Live to celebrate this time where we gather all of the good and delicious things into one place. I have grabbed the good and delicious and extremely exciting very first Critical Role prose novel, Vox Machina Kitten Kin, and the writer of said novel. Please welcome back to the channel, Marieke Nijkamp. Hi.
Hi, lovely to be back.
Thrilled, obviously, that you could join us to talk a little bit about what this is, why people might want to be excited, and what we might be able to learn from your example as we weave our own stories in games and fiction, or both. But first off, the book is out in 1 week from today. How are you doing?
I'm super excited, also super nervous. Basically, pre-book jitters times a million. So yeah, no, I'm doing great. I'm so excited for it to be out.
I'm particularly excited to get my hands on to have gotten my hands on this one. Sorry, not to brag. Thank you very much for letting me sneak a peek at it. But of course, I already love your work and already know you as a TTRPG person, so it feels like a beautiful piece of destiny. But for folks who might not be familiar, would you tell us a little bit about your own history with fantasy fiction or TTRPGs?
Yeah, absolutely. I have been a fantasy reader for pretty much my entire life, as you can not quite tell by the bookshelves behind me, but most of the shelves you can see right now are fantasy books. So I started reading Lord of the Rings when I was like 10, which is definitely an appropriate age, and never looked back. And basically rolled into all the other fantasy books from there, and rolled into playing Dungeons and Dragons in my like early teens, I guess. So that's always been a pretty big part of my life. I always thought I was going to be a fantasy writer at some point. I just never thought that it wouldn't be my first book, but my I don't know how many fifth, fourth, sixth. I don't know how to count my books because they're all different.
You've, of course,
Yes.
worked in short stories, editing anthologies, in long form fiction, and just to pull out my, we can't get through a stream without me referencing comics, and we never will. But I have to in this case because we have Marieke Nijkamp here, the author of The Oracle Code, and the forthcoming Hawkeye Kate Bishop.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so that's happening too. Like tomorrow. I'm I'm just like I'm basically not stopping to think and just sort of rolling through and enjoying all of it. Because once I stop and think about it, it just gets really overwhelming in a good way, but super overwhelming.
Well,
There,
we
yeah,
will.
I'm working on all of my dream projects right now. It's the best feeling.
I'm so glad. Okay, let's talk about this specific one
Yep.
because it is tremendously exciting. Of course, the world of Critical Role exists in game form, exists in source book form, exists in beautiful, beautiful comic book form, but now it is coming for the first time to long form prose fiction. Hold it in your hand. There's a map in the front. Fantasy
It's the
novel.
prettiest. It's
What
so
is Vox
pretty.
Magnet Kitten Kin?
So it's a prequel story about the amazing twins Vex and Vax, long, long, long before Vox Machina. Well, a few years before Vox Machina, and it's a really good introduction to two of the best characters in TTR RPGs. So I would say read it, probably. Please read it. No, definitely read it. It's so
We will
obnoxious.
not.
I love this book so much, which just feels so wrong to say, but I think it's really, really great.
And I believe other folks are going to agree. When
I hope
selfishly, I'm
so.
not the only person who's had a chance to look at it. Um,
Just
uh,
keep showing it off. Just like rub it in.
I'm trying not to, but it's like it's so pretty. Um,
It's
of
so
course,
pretty.
Vex and Vax, for those who might not be familiar with Critical Role, it is, well, most of you watching this will be, but there's always somebody's
So
first
I
time,
sort of
and
assumed
that's
that.
but that's a beautiful thing. It is a Dungeons and Dragons TTRPG show that has been running for several years, was a home game before that, has made a place in many, many of our hearts. And two of the central characters in the first campaign over Critical Role were Voxlan and Vexalia, played by Liam O'Brien and Laura Bailey. Um, and they are delightful twin half elves. I believe this is all not spoilers because it's just regular stuff.
Nope.
Um, uh, they are two wonderful and beloved characters that we get to learn a little bit more about. And as you were putting this together, you said that the territory is some prequel territory to what we would have seen in
Yeah.
campaign one. Um, what did you find appealing about the twins as subjects and their story?
I love writing books about siblings. That seems to be a general theme in my books for I don't know, I'm the eldest of 3, so that probably influences my writing in general and, like, who I am in general. But I love writing about family, about, like, familial bonds, found family, and, like, the twins, their story has all of those elements of, like, 2 people who stand together against the rest of the world, but also like slowly learn to trust other people and form their own extended like found family. And it's so beautiful.
I will say that's a theme that particularly made me excited for them to be subjects of the first book because I am also one of three and would like to think I am as fiercely devoted to them as these characters are. But it is a very fun bond to return to in fiction because I don't know
Yeah,
I can never get enough of those stories. So thank you. Hmm? What
same.
without dipping too much into the content, what themes were you excited to explore with this story in the book?
um oh god, it's so hard to talk about this without like accidentally giving anything away. I think it's definitely a book about family and specifically about home and what home means. um and oh god. I think what I really wanted to do with this book is because we meet the twins before Vox Machina, and if you know the story a little bit, you know that they have like a complicated childhood, um, complicated family life. And what I wanted to do is sort of take that moment between feeling like you're alone in the world and you only have each other and being open to maybe connecting to other people and eventually to Vox Machina and what all of that means and sort of play in the gray area in between so that you're still figuring out like what like who do I want to be, what does home mean to me, what does family mean to me, what does like what should my next steps be. And I think all of that like explicitly or less so plays a role in the book. And it definitely like it isn't that the entire book centers around those questions the entire time. It's also just an adventure story, and fun stuff happens, and there are mysteries and adventures. But that definitely played into how I plotted the book and how I approached it.
Now, was there this is just I like to ask people questions because I have never written a novel and I think it's extremely cool. Did you have the whole shape of it in mind from the start? Did you know who you wanted to focus on and what direction it was going? Or was it like we got partway into this process and you were like, aha, here's the story?
Mostly the former, and that's basically my way of writing in general. Like I love to have a good sense of what the story should be and what the shape of the story should be before I start writing it. Because if I don't, I will inevitably just get lost and wander off and write something completely different, which is fun but ridiculously unproductive. So I like having a sense of story. Like I'm working on a completely different book right now, and like half of my desktop is different colored flashcards and note cards just so I can like figure out where everything needs to be and how everything fits together. And that was definitely the case for this book too. So I started with a pitch, like rough idea of what the book needed to be, and sort of rolled into a very general outline from there. And some things changed in the process of writing and editing it, but I think mostly stayed true to what I envisioned it to be. So that's definitely like says a lot too about how fun it was to work on this book, because once I started writing it just felt like I could go on forever, and it just like every decision made sense for the characters, and occasionally it felt like I was just along for the ride, and got to follow along and got to write everything. So yeah, this is definitely plotted from the start and just followed those steps fairly neatly.
I will say, I that sense that you are like the sense that you sort of knew how the characters would behave certainly comes through as a reader. You are in an interesting situation working on something like this because, critters, we have spent many hours hanging out with these
Mhm.
characters. And it feels like you have done, I think, an incredible job of bringing them to the page where I was like, "Yep, that's what they'd say. That's what would happen. That's what." Oh, that was a good surprise, but a logical one. Um, I'm very curious about. You've worked in worlds with established fictions before, obviously. You've written for
Mhm.
everyone from Barbara Gordon to Kate Bishop. Look, I'm just focusing on my faves. Um, but is there anything different about approaching one when you're adapting an existing story world that's a little different from like 80 Years of Batman or one specific story you're doing a sequel to?
Yes and no. In a lot of ways, the writing itself is the same. But when I'm writing Barbara Gordon or Kate Bishop, I'm writing an interpretation of a character that other people have interpreted too. And it feels like you're all sort of in conversation with like this concept of a character, and we're all focusing on different aspects of. And that makes sense because that's just how it works. And in this particular case, I was sometimes literally in conversation with the people behind the characters, but it wasn't so much that I was like fifth person in line to create an interpretation. I obviously there have not been any novels before, but also there's a very established sense of who the characters are, not as interpretations, but as who they are. So there's definitely a difference in approach there, and I think that's for me that was a lot of fun. Like you don't usually get to talk to your characters, and this is about as close as it felt like. So yeah, no, that definitely changed the approach, but at the same time, like the writing is still the same, and you still want to do justice to the characters. You still want to write them as well as you can be, and as recognizably as you can be. So occasionally there's like a difference in focusing on slightly different aspects than what you could do in different forms of media, but it still has to be the same character, as it still has to be recognizably the twins, obviously.
I love that. So it is interesting where, obviously comics is a good example of having multiple authors at many different stages bringing things in, um, as opposed to sort of a like maybe a traditional novel that has a singular author with the editors and other secret influences who make books what they are. Um, when you was there anything about like balancing sort of the fidelity to the characters with the fidelity to the world building or other sort of lore and source material?
Um, I mean, it definitely was never an issue by any means, because the characters obviously exist in the broader world. So it felt more like dipping into that and finding the right story to tell to finding the right story for this particular novel. But it's such a rich world to play in, and there's so much history there, and there's so much like so many elements that I knew that I could have fun with in like the context of this story, and so many like things that were referenced on stream that I sort of wanted take and run with because they made sense for this particular story and for the characters. But yeah, this is such a rich world, and these are such rich characters with like such history that it didn't feel like I had to do much to make that happen on page, and that was such a delight.
I love that very much. But of course, in addition to being fictional characters with dramatic stories that we love very much, they're also Dungeons and Dragons characters. Can you talk a little bit
Mhm.
about writing the sort of D&D world of it all? And by that I mean like reading some of these action scenes, I felt like I could imagine. I was like, all right, if I needed to tell you how this went turn by turn, I think I could do it.
Mhm.
Now, I may be making that up in my head, but that's what it felt like in a really fun way. How did you write it from a game perspective? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wasn't sitting at my computer rolling dice for these characters to make sure that I knew what was going to happen. But I did want to sort of recognize that sense of how action would play out at the table and find a good way to combine that with fiction. And I think there's one of the fun things about how like economics work in D&D is that because it's turn by turn, you get a really good sense of where everyone is and what everyone's doing, and that's really helpful for fiction too, especially because fight scenes tend to be fairly chaotic. Um, it's easy to lose the plot, so it's super helpful to basically approach this as a okay, but let's focus on Vex first and see what happens. Let's focus on one of the secondary characters next and see what happens, and sort of roll through that both as a sort of nod to the types of like the background of these characters, but also as a way of taking the reader by the hand and guiding them through the action. So for me, it was actually I really loved approaching it that way, and it's definitely something that I'm thinking about. Like, how can I use that in different books? How can I use that in different types of stories? Because it creates a sort of clarity that I think is super helpful both for me as a writer and for a reader as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right. Let's see. Would you say that Vox Machina Kitten Kin makes a good entry point for someone who might not yet be in the critter family?
It should be, yeah. I definitely wrote it as such. I wrote it as being accessible to people who know next to nothing about Critical Role, and who just want to get their first intro, while at the same time being aware of like all the fans who know every single detail from all these years of campaigns. So there's fun Easter eggs and fun nods to stuff that happens during the campaign as well. But it was definitely intended to be accessible and not too overwhelming if you don't know all of that. Like the story still functions perfectly well without recognizing those Easter eggs or without recognizing those subtle little hints. Um, but yeah, it should have a little bit for both readers, I guess, both types of readers.
I can vouch for the fact that there are certain things that you're like, oh, this is foreboding. That's really just as a bonus factor. Like the story will get where it's going
Yeah,
anyway. Hmm?
yeah. Mhm.
uh, let's see. We have a couple of questions that have come in about the process. If you have anything to say on these, Capybara Drift would like to know if you had Laura and Liam's voices in your head as you wrote Vex and Vax.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's any other way to approach that. So yes, I and part of that too was like in preparation for this book, and especially once I had like the outline, there were definitely moments that I knew had to come back in the book or had to be referenced in one way or another. So I went back and watched like episodes and random scenes. So that definitely helped like solidify the voices too for as much as that was necessary because I spent entirely too much time watching campaign one at least once, maybe more than once. Um,
I love it. It's
yeah,
like,
no, there's
oh
no
no,
way.
we need to put it back on and check something. Oh, how terrible. Mm.
Oops! Oh no. Yeah, pretty much that.
Although I will say, from a craft level, I it is it's a truly astounding amount of research sort of tackle when, there are other things where it would sort of be like, here's a one sheet with everything you need to know. And here it's like 7,000 hours of story. Good luck.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it definitely helped that I had seen those various hours of story. Yeah, I love it. Like I love having that richness of like history of characters. But I can imagine it's pretty intimidating too.
let's see. Oh, a great one from Rocket47 who is referencing the audiobook version. I don't know. If you have, I don't know how these things work. Have you already heard the audio version?
I just got the files last week, so I've been listening to it, and it's just spectacular. It's so good.
So their question is, did
It's
you enjoy
super
hearing your
surreal.
words performed by the actors
Yes.
in the audiobook? Oh, neat.
Yes, it's extremely surreal. But God, it's so good. The audiobook is amazing. I heartily recommend getting both the hardcover and the audiobook. And
We
the
were
ebook
having
while you're at it.
we a brief discussion before stream of being kids reading fantasy novels, and that as much as I have loved everything else to do with CR, there is just something amazing about opening a book and having a map in the front.
Yes.
It's incredible work from the map maker and cover artist on this one, which I should.
Yes, cover artist is Nikki Dawes and map maker. I have those notes here. Let me just make sure. Andy Law for the map.
Excellent.
And it's
Thank you. Sorry, I meant
basically
to
a map.
write down those credits. I appreciate that save very much because they did incredible work on these. And that is coming at you soon when Vox Machina Kitten Kin
Hmm.
hits shelves in 1 week. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about that. And I have a few more questions for you about games and writing and all of that, but I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
It's D&D.